much for joining me today for our fourth week in our study of Isaiah this fall. We are jumping ahead to chapter 23 this week, but let's go ahead and pray as we get started. God, I thank you so much for today, and I thank you that we can join together and we can open your word together. And I pray that as we do that, God, that you will speak to our hearts. You will open our minds to what you have to say to us through your word, God. And God, we just love you so much. And we thank you for everything you do for us. And we thank you for who you are. We pray all of this in Jesus' holy and precious name. Amen. So as I said, this is our fourth week in Isaiah. And last week we were in chapter 7. And we saw King Ahaz with this choice that he had to make between trust God to save him from this threat of an attack from the kings of Israel and Syria, or trust the Assyrians. And we know from other places in scripture what King Ahaz chose. And so that's where we left things last week. And this week, though, we're going to be jumping all the way ahead to chapter 23. We unfortunately don't have time to go through every single chapter in Isaiah this fall, but I definitely encourage you to be reading it on your own. There is so much to be just to hear in these words written so long ago, and God can really move. So I really encourage you to be reading every day a little bit in Isaiah. And there is a reading plan in our study guide, our adult Sunday school study guide. So I encourage you to take a look at that and to get yourself in the word this fall. So we're going to be in chapter 23 today. And this is the end of a section. So for last week, we had read all the way through chapter 12, even though we only talked about chapter 7. Well, this week we read a chunk from 13 through 23. And this section is a group of oracles against the various nations in the ancient Near East. And so we can split these in two. So you have a first section that goes from roughly 13 through around Isaiah 20, and then you have another section at 21 through 23. And they're oracles against all of these different nations. And as we read through, there's really not any nations that are left out. We mentioned Babylon, and Assyria is kind of included in there. We have Philistia, Moab, Syria, Cush, Egypt, Edom, Arabia, Jerusalem, and finally Tyre and Sidon. And it's very interesting because there's not really a nation that's left out that is in that region of the world. And it's Isaiah is speaking God's judgment on each one of these nations for different reasons, very unique to the different nations themselves. So in our first group of oracles, we have a more of an emphasis on the people of God being amidst this political turmoil in the ancient Near East and the different as they interact with these different nations. And in the second group, we have a little bit more of a religious emphasis on the judgment that we see that Isaiah is pronouncing. And so that's kind of what we're going to see. So in Isaiah 23, we get the oracle against the city of Tyre. And Tyre was a Phoenician seaport located on the Mediterranean Sea, about 100 miles northwest of Jerusalem. And it's interesting as you look across this section from Isaiah 13 through 23, and you have this, you have Babylon is at the beginning of this section, and so you have Babylon, which is the furthest east commercial political power, and then you have Tyre, which would be the furthest west in this group of nations, and so that's kind of interesting. It kind of spans the geography as well. And Tyre was a commercial center. It was a port. And also included is Sidon, which was nearby. So there was lots of trade. Their geography kind of demanded that they would be a sea power, a seaport, and not a land control of lots of land, because there was mountains right there. So they pretty much had the ocean, and that was it. And so that's Tyre. And they were known for their pride and their commercial success. And so we'll see some of that as we read this passage in a minute. So another thing that came up for me when I was reading this week and studying about Tyre and about its influence and interaction with Israel as a nation. So we have King David. He had a pretty amicable relationship with the king of Tyre, and Solomon did as well. But the interesting thing is Solomon had some Phoenician wives from that area, and they definitely brought their idols and their ways of worship with them. And so you get a little bit of a responsibility for the corruption of King Solomon and corruption of the true worship of God in that as well. So it's interesting. So even though there was not necessarily a warring relationship, they were more allies, there is still a little bit of this undercurrent of, well, but Solomon married these foreign wives, and he definitely married more foreign wives than just the ones from Phoenicia. But we get this corruption that's seeping in to the true worship of God. And it was from this influence from people who were worshiping idols from other places. So that's kind of our background of Tyre before we read. So we're going to look at Isaiah 23, and we're going to focus in on verses 8 through 18. We're not going to read the whole passage or the whole chapter. But the first part of chapter 23 talks a lot about the people of Tyre and Sidon and the merchants and how they were seafarers. And so we're going to pick up here in verse 8, where it's really starting to zero in on the judgment that's going to come on Tyre. So Isaiah 23, 8 through 18. Who planned this against Tyre, the bestower of crowns, whose merchants are princes, whose traders are renowned in the earth? The Lord Almighty planned it, to bring down her pride in all her splendor, and to humble all who are renowned on the earth. Till your land as they do along the Nile, daughter Tarshish, for you no longer have a harbor. The Lord has stretched out his hand over the sea and made its kingdoms tremble. He has given an order concerning Phoenicia, that her fortress be destroyed. He said, no more of your reveling, virgin daughter Sidon, now crushed. Up, cross over to Cyprus. Even there you will find no rest. Look at the land of the Babylonians, this people that is now of no account. The Assyrians have made it a place for desert creatures. They raised up their siege towers. They stripped its fortresses bare and turned it into a ruin. Wail, you ships of Tarshish, your fortress is destroyed. At that time, Tyre will be forgotten for 70 years, the span of a king's life. But at the end of these 70 years, it will happen to Tyre as in the song of the prostitute. Take up a harp, walk through the city, you forgotten prostitute. Play the harp well, sing many a song, so that you will be remembered. At the end of 70 years, the Lord will deal with Tyre. She will return to her lucrative prostitution and will ply her trade with all the kingdoms on the face of the earth. Yet her profit and her earnings will be set apart for the Lord, and they will not be stored up or hoarded. Her profits will go to those who live before the Lord, for abundant food and fine clothes. So as we look at this passage in Isaiah 23, one of the first things that stands out to me, there's two things that really jump off the page. Well, the first one is this idea of God being the one who is sovereign over all of the nations. And we get that picture through this whole section from 13 through 23, and that God is the one who is bringing this judgment on these nations, that they will not go unpunished for their worship of idols, for their way that they are living life. And I think it's really interesting as we see who planned this against Tyre. Well, the Lord Almighty planned it. That's what it says in verse 9. To bring down her pride in all her splendor and to humble all who are renowned on the earth. And I think that as we think through this, there's a theme of don't turn to the nations for help because they're not outside of God's judgment. You need to only turn to God. So at this point, we have already seen King Ahaz and that interaction. Last week we talked about that. And then in this section, we also learned that Ahaz has passed on. And so then our next king is Hezekiah. And so scholars say that in some ways this is a way to talk to Hezekiah and say, hey, look, here's your proof. Look, all these other nations are going to fail ultimately. God is the only source of hope, the only source of help that you can rely on, because all of these other nations will be judged. All of these other nations will be found wanting, and they are all temporary. Only God is the one who will last, who has always been and will always be. And so you get this sense of this sovereign God who is over all of these things. And we can have conversations about, well, is God, how does God's sovereignty work? How does he ordain things, and how do things happen in the world? And how instrumental is he in every single tiny little detail? And what does that have to do with free will? And we can have a conversation about that. And I think that's an important conversation. But I'm not really going to go there today. I think we don't really have very much time to go there today. But I do think one of the things that we can take from this is that God is not removed from what happens in the world. He is involved in our lives. He's involved in the lives of nations. And he is not just sitting far away and just kind of watching everything happen. He is sovereign over it all. So he will use what is happening to bring about his ultimate purposes in the world. So as we look at this passage, and as we continue to go through Isaiah, I think that's something we can continue to think about, is how God is sovereign, how the nations don't control God. I mean, these nations specifically thought they could control the gods. They worshiped idols, and that's how it worked. You did certain things to make the gods do certain things. But here we have a picture of God saying, you don't get to just act certain ways to make me do things. I'm going to act, I'm God, I'm going to respond and do things the way that I'm going to do them, irregardless of if you've done the right, if you've figured out the formula or not. There isn't a formula. There is follow God, worship God, live for him, not try to control him by through manipulative practices. But that is how a lot of the pagan religion worked. It was do these things, do this certain sacrifice, do this certain practice in order to make the god do whatever, to appease the sea god for whatever voyage you're about to go on. So there was a much more manipulative view. So in this, we see God portrayed as, well, you don't control me. I am actually the one in control. That's what God is saying. And I love that picture that we see here. And we see that through this whole section. So that's one of the first things that jumps off the page at me. The other thing that really jumps off the page at me is that God is going to restore Tyre. Like, they're going to be restored. And exactly what this 70 years is mentioning, that's mentioned here in verse 15, exactly what it refers to, scholars are a little bit unsure as to exactly how to place that in history or exactly what it refers to. But the idea that Tyre would be restored, I think is very interesting and very true to God's nature. God is a redeeming God, and he is a God who gives us a second chance and gives us a third and fourth and fifth and sixth chance. And so we see that here at the end of chapter 23, where Tyre is restored. And there's some interesting conversations here about this idea of the prostitute's earnings being set apart for the Lord, because in Deuteronomy, we have Deuteronomy 23, there is a definite prohibition against the earnings of a prostitute being given to the Lord. But I think one of the interesting things here is that now when Tyre is restored, it's not just that Tyre is restored, but Tyre is going to be restored and have allegiance to God. So exactly how the money comes about is not necessarily as important as the fact that Tyre will be restored and will be restored to a relationship with the God of Israel. And that's pretty awesome. And what a beautiful picture. And it brings up the words of Psalm 87. And I think this is also beautiful. It talks about how in Psalm 87, starting in verse 3, glorious things are said of you, city of God. I will record Rahab and Babylon among those who acknowledge me, Philistia and Tyre along with Cush, and will say, this one was born in Zion. Indeed, of Zion it will be said, the one and that one were born in her, and the Most High himself will establish her. And the Lord will write in the register of the peoples, this one was born in Zion. As they make music, they will sing, all my fountains are in you. And this idea, this picture of the nations being restored. And I think that is very beautiful. We have earlier in Isaiah, the picture of Egypt turning to God and worshiping the one true God. And you get this beautiful picture that even though there's judgment on these different nations, that the people, there'll be a restoration where the people can turn to God. And I think that's awesome and beautiful. So as we're thinking about this passage today, I was thinking, I'm very much mindful of what's going on in our world currently and just kind of how do we see God at work in our world? I think that's something a question that's brought up, especially when you read through Isaiah and you see how God is instrumental and uses these different nations to bring about his different purposes, and how does that all exactly work? And so maybe start thinking about the season that we're in right now and how this coronavirus pandemic is definitely going to be one of those cataclysmic generation defining moments. And the most interesting thing about it is it's something that is going to be defining our entire world. There is not a people that I have heard in the world that have been left untouched by this virus. And I think of other cataclysmic things that have happened in my life, but I think for all of us, I'm sure if you were to sit back and think and list out world events that were cataclysmic and like the kind of events where you remember where you were, so like 9/11 or maybe when JFK was assassinated, those different types of events. But for all of us, I think that we have this shared experience of this coronavirus pandemic. And I think that's so interesting as we think about world events and we think about the things that are going on in our world. And as we start to think about, okay, well, what is God doing in the midst of these things? I'm not going to say, oh, God's causing all these things, because that's not what I believe. I think that God is going to be working in the midst of these things that are happening in our world, because our world is broken, our world is fallen, and our world is crying out for the new creation, for the new heaven and the new earth. And so as we look at these different events, I think it's interesting as we start to see how God is at work and how he's still at work. So even though we're going through this pandemic, even though we are speeding towards an election season that has already been and promises to continue being very tumultuous, very much full of anger and strife and impassioned, maybe not always the best way expressed opinions. But as we speed towards that and as we experience these different situations, is to remember that God is sovereign and that he is at work no matter what is going on. No matter if my chosen person wins an election or not. God is sovereign and he is at work no matter what. And he is not thrown off by this pandemic. He's not thrown off by the unrest that is in a lot of places in our country that we've seen across our country. He is not thrown off by any of this. He is sovereign and he is at work and he is moving in the midst of all of this. And I think that can bring us a lot of peace and a lot of hope in the midst of a lot of really dark times. And I know that as we continue to move through, especially the pandemic itself, and hopefully towards an end I don't really know when, so I'm not going to say, but an end in the future, as we move towards it, I think we will continue to see, oh wow, God is doing this and he's been doing this all along. And sometimes it's easier to see when we look backwards, but also I think it's important for us to be talking to God and spending time with him on a daily basis saying, God, where are you at work right now? And how can I join you there? Because God is at work everywhere. And he, it's so awesome because he calls us to join him in that work. And that's what we can do as we go forward, as we continue through the pandemic, as we go through this election season, as we go through whatever is coming forward and coming towards us in 2021 and beyond. We can go forward knowing that God is sovereign and that he is always at work, always working about his perfect plan and bringing about his perfect plan for the world. He's always working to bring that about. And that should bring us peace. And it should allow us to maybe breathe a sigh of relief. It does for me. Helps me go, okay, everything's not as crazy as maybe I think it is. It is crazy. There is a lot going on. But God is sovereign and he's with us. And that's just so awesome. So I hope that as you read Isaiah, and especially as you read these words, these different oracles that were against these different nations, that you're reminded of God's sovereignty and his love for humanity and how he has always been at work restoring and redeeming and bringing us back into right relationship. And he laid that foundation well before Jesus even came. It was already at work, even at the beginning. And he was always calling us towards himself. And that's pretty awesome. And that brings us a lot of peace and hope in this time. Thanks so much for joining me today. And I'll be back next week as we keep going through Isaiah. Bye.